Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Nice. I am a Principal Program Manager in our team's Customer Engineering team, and I will be taking you through our Energize Your Live Events with Microsoft Teams content. So during this session, a couple key points that we want to talk about here. The audience for this session is really anyone that wants to organize, produce, speak, present at any type of large virtual event utilizing the Microsoft Teams stack. So what we want to take you through here is how to understand some of the best practices to make sure that your virtual event is successful using our Teams stack. We'll give you some practical and technical knowledge to ensure that you understand how to align the product itself with the vision that you have for your event. We'll talk a little bit about various roles like attendees, presenters, and producers, who does what and where. We'll do a little bit of knowledge transfer on the before, the during, and the after tactics that we use when we use our events themselves. So we can talk a little bit about things that you want to prepare for before the event starts, things you want to be cognizant of during the event, and then follow-up items that you'll want to do once the event is concluded. Now, all of the content that we're going to be talking about here is encapsulated in our virtual event playbook. You can see it on the slide here, aka.ms/virtualeventplaybook. There's actually two playbooks out there. There's the main virtual event playbook, which will take you through the foundational components of virtual events. And then there's an advanced production playbook, which will go deep into the specifics of how to do some of the more advanced productions using external encoders and the like. So let's level set and talk a little bit about virtual events that are powered by Microsoft Teams. There's a large flavor of virtual event types that are out there for customers and organizations. And Teams has the capability of being able to support a wide range of these types of events. For example, as you see on the left-hand side here, we could leverage Teams to deliver training to our employees, to our managers, to our partners. Another common scenario is to utilize Teams to deliver all hands or all company meetings, as you see in the center here. But we can also leverage the Teams technology to host large conferences online and do some lead generation. These could be large conferences along the lines of something like our Microsoft Ignite, or they could be a lead gen effort where perhaps you're doing a series of webinars and you're gathering attendee information as a result. There's a couple of pieces of the Teams stack that we can leverage for this. The most common when we're in a scenario like the broadcast type scenario is to leverage what we call Microsoft Teams live events. Live events will get us the ability to reach up to 100,000 folks to watch the broadcast. We have the opportunity of engaging with them through a moderated Q&A type experience, and we can provide some more advanced production techniques to allow our show to have a little bit more of that production prosumer style feel. Now, we will cover more of that as we go throughout the session, but again, I want to remind, and you'll see this link a lot throughout the session, always check out aka.ms/virtualeventplaybook for all of the gory details, since we're not going to be able to go too deep in the short amount of time that we have together. Now, as I mentioned before, when we look at the landscape of virtual events, there's a large swath of different virtual event types that we have out there. This slide is meant to showcase some of the most common virtual event scenarios that we see. Now, as a result of the last year or so with this pandemic that we've been in, we've seen a dramatic shift in the concept of virtual events. Everything from virtual conferences, which you see on the left side here, where we have the single or multi-day type experiences, to town halls, the few to many type experiences where we don't have full-on interactivity, but we do have an ability to do managed Q&A type questioning. Public broadcasts, as you see in the middle, again, a few to many type scenario, but maybe outreaching past your company to the general public. The ability to do what we would call multi-guest panels or fireside chats. The example you see here in this slide that I've got my pointer on was our internal town hall, where we had our senior leadership team available for an employee town hall Q&A, and we could rotate in the various speakers in this multi-guest panel style view. These are some of the examples, but of course the sky's the limit, right? The idea of a virtual event is you can really construct this based on what the needs are for your attendees that you're trying to reach. Now, key point to realize, scale and complexity absolutely matter, right? Production events, many of these types, they can be self-produced. They don't necessarily require you to have 20 plus years of AV production experience. However, when you start looking at scenarios like our multi-guest panel, or you start looking at our virtual conferences world, now we're really dealing with something that might require a broader team, and most likely would require a broader team to be able to facilitate this type of event. Now, again, in our playbook, we have breakdowns of the various production roles that help you align your team to be set up for success. Now, to give some practical examples of virtual events that we have facilitated from the Microsoft side, we have the NFL, the American football sport, that we have built out our NFL fan mosaic, allowing our fans to be able to be within a team's experience, showcase their audio video, and build out a mosaic wall like you see here that was present at the end zones of the various events themselves, but also within the television broadcast. We had the Singapore FinTech Festival, which was a financial services festival where we had hosted the entire event through Microsoft Teams. It was a highly secured event, ran for multiple days, 24 hours a day, round the clock, all facilitated in the Teams application itself. You might have heard of the work we did with the NBA from a basketball perspective. We built the fan wall that you see here. This is a series of LEDs leveraging our Teams Together mode, where we constructed these LED wall views of fans courtside. The folks that were participating in that not only got a chance to show up on the telecast as fans sitting at the game virtually, but they also had a feed piped into their Teams meeting to be able to watch the game as if they were courtside. If you've ever attended the Consumer Electronics Show, this past year we went all virtual for Consumer Electronics Show, and we ran that event through our online virtual events platform. And we also had the Prada and Miu Miu fashion festivals, where we actually had, as you can see here, a wall of participants able to participate in the fashion show event utilizing a virtual type approach. So given the events of the past year or so, obviously things have changed just a little bit, and we've encountered this wonderful world of what we call virtual events. Now, virtual events has a couple of different meanings depending on context or who you're talking to or which platform you're using. So we want to kind of level set things here with our Virtual Events 101 and take you through how the Teams stack stands up to this concept of a virtual event, and that's by using our Teams meetings, Teams webinars, and Teams live events, which we'll cover on the next set of slides. So as we talk about virtual events, let's briefly look at the technology stack in Teams that can support the virtual event platform. Essentially, there's three main areas. We have meetings, we have webinars, and we have live events. Now we're going to go in depth into each of these in the coming slides. But before we get in depth to that, I want to make sure that I stress the first key piece is to make sure that we understand our audience, because that is going to be the driving factor in which area of technology in Teams we choose. So with Teams meetings, these are generally designed to be highly interactive. Now, you have the opportunity to turn on levels of interactivity at appropriate times throughout the Teams meeting. And I'll show you how to do that a little bit later in the deck as we talk about the concept of meeting options. But essentially, meetings provide the ability to do chat, audio video conferencing, collab, apps, all up to 1,000 interactive participants based on appropriate licensing. We can also leverage features such as our Together mode and breakout rooms. Keeping in mind, though, that if we're going to leverage breakout rooms within a Teams meeting, we currently have a limit of up to 300 attendees to support the breakout room feature. If we have more than 300 folks, we wouldn't be able to utilize the breakout room feature. I do want to remind you, of course, that when we look at the Teams meeting space, this is the ability for us to have interactivity. We can choose to turn some of these features off for our attendees, but the key piece here is it's an option for us based on that attendee type. Now, as I mentioned earlier, webinars are an extension of Microsoft Teams meetings. So all of the pieces that I had talked about before that we look at with meetings, the level of interactivity that we want, the ability to mute folks or turn off their video, and all of those controls and features are available in webinars as well. But you get the added benefit with a webinar of being able to tack on registration reporting. This allows me to have folks sign up to attend the webinar, and during that registration process, I can not only gather intel on who is registering, but I can ask leading questions or exploratory questions on the registration page itself. So folks can put in relevant info that I, as a presenter, can now use to kind of tailor the webinar experience based on what I now know about my planned attendees. Attendees will get to the registration page with email confirmations. We will then be able to have downloadable not only registration reports, but also attendee participation reports that we can ingest into our CRM or marketing platforms. And as we go to schedule these webinars, we have the opportunity to schedule them as what we would call private, or only in tenant or only in company folks, or public, where essentially anyone could register for my webinar. Now, as mentioned, webinars are built on the same stack as meetings. I mean, essentially they are meetings. So they follow the same logic of scale, where we can support up to 1,000 folks in this interactive webinar experience. In this interactive experience, we can also add apps to the experience, giving us the ability to do things such as polls, Q&A. Obviously, we will have base chat features as well. But because it's a meeting, you also get the base meeting features, such as being able to raise your hand and have reactions fly across the screen. As the facilitator of the webinar, I can moderate the attendees during the meeting. What that means is I can control whether they're allowed to come off mute, whether they're allowed to turn their cameras on. I could even promote certain folks from the attendee role to a presenter role. And then maybe if they're done presenting, I could demote them back from the presenter role back into an attendee role. All of these items that I've been talking about on control are done through what we would call our meeting options setting. This gives the organizer the additional, what I typically refer to as nerd knobs, right, to control exactly what the experience should be. So we have the ability to toggle whether the attendees can turn their camera on or not, whether the attendees can turn their microphone on or not. And again, these are policies or settings that we can do at the meeting option level at the time we create the webinar. But these are also options that we can change on the fly while the webinar is running. Very cool stuff. And lastly, we have the idea of this advanced presenter layouts. We're just in the process now of beginning to roll out our advanced presenter layouts, starting with the standout mode. The standout mode is essentially where we're presenting PowerPoint content and we overlay our video on top of the PowerPoint, essentially like the weatherman type process. It's essentially, I'll wait, this one right here, where you get that view. And this is all built in natively into the Teams application. The out-of-the-box presenter modes are available to the Teams presenters themselves, and then the attendees would be able to consume that experience. We can also leverage technologies such as PowerPoint Live to be able to stream the PowerPoint appropriately to our attendees and get some of the more advanced features of presenting the PowerPoint through a streaming endpoint. Now, again, many of these features are also controlled from an administrative standpoint, such as being able to add a webinar or registration. So if you don't happen to see those features, you might need to have a little chat with your IT admin to see if those features can be enabled for you. You can always check out our roadmap on aka.ms/Office 365 roadmap. You can see up on the slide here. This is the place to go to keep track of what we have publicly referenced as coming in the Teams application. This is a shot of the registration feature, which is also known as webinar. And you can see we can search for registration. It'll pop up here and it'll give you an idea of when that is expected to release. This particular feature, the registration webinar feature, is currently available to all of our commercial tenants. Now, as we start looking across the spectrum of virtual event types, we are going to find there is a type of virtual event where we will not necessarily require a high level of interactivity, but we would require a large scale of attendee. That is a perfect scenario for Teams live events. Live events are an extension of our meetings platform that enable a broadcast scenario. This is very appropriate when you have a very large contingent of attendees and you are not expecting those attendees to interact in an audio-video type way, right? So for example, with our town halls that we do inside of Microsoft, going to 100,000 folks, we're generally not going to have 100,000 folks all raise their hand and come off mute and directly ask questions. That's not really manageable. But being able to reach all 100,000 folks with the core message that we want, and then providing an avenue for questions through a moderated Q&A type experience is quite appropriate for that type of scenario. And that's where live events fits in. Right? These are well suited for virtual or even hybrid event broadcasts. They can scale up to, currently it's 20,000 attendees for Teams produced live events. That is through the end of this calendar year. You can even reach further than that if you leverage Microsoft Stream, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We do provide support for moderated Q&A, so attendees can ask questions, which will go to a moderated panel, and moderators can then choose to promote those questions or bring those questions up to the event team. We have capabilities of doing highly professional broadcasts with these types of events, which again, if you're reaching that large of an audience, you generally would have a more seasoned production staff that would be putting this type of event together, although not required. We're able to do streaming in this instance so that my attendees are actually consuming a stream and watching the event. And with that production capability, it opens up opportunities for the team to use what we would call encoders, which I'll dive a little bit deeper into as we go throughout this session. As mentioned earlier, and you'll see a couple of times on the slide, some of these features are admin controlled. So if for some reason you go into your Teams client and you don't see the opportunity to enable a live event, again, you might need to have a chat with your IT administrator and make sure that you have that particular feature enabled for you. Now, when we go and double click into the idea of a live event, there are essentially two types of live events that we can do inside of Teams itself. And it really comes down to where are we going to do the production? Like, where is the content going to be built, right? The first and most common option that we have when you schedule a live event is to use what we would call a Teams produced live event. So the first option here, when I go to schedule my live event, I can tell the system, yep, I'm going to go ahead and produce this in Teams. That's basically the plug and play, or what we used to refer to as the quick start option for a live event. You'll get an experience like you see here. If you're familiar with joining a Teams meeting and you're familiar with using the Teams client, the interface will be very familiar to you. This is what the producer console looks like inside of live events, right? I'll have all of my event team here, my presenters, my content, what have you. I can queue that up on the left here. I can send it live on the right, and boom, we're done. Like, all of the management of the event, all the production of the event is all done here within the Teams client. Now, that's very convenient, but it's also a little limiting because there's only so much you can do with the features that we give you in the Teams producer experience today. The second option is to select a radio button that states external app or device produced. Now, in this option, you're not actually using Teams to generate the content. Right? Essentially, what you're using the Teams client for is to wire up all of the plumbing to get your encoder, which is where you're actually producing the event, right, or your external app. You're getting that all wired up to the service so that it can broadcast out to the attendee, right? So you can see in the screenshot here, I'm in the Teams client, but notice this looks a lot different, right? All I'm getting here, this is an embed window of content, right? The content that's in this window, this is not being generated by Teams, right? This is content that's generally being generated by an external encoder or external piece of hardware. Now, I will go a little deeper in this session of an example of how to do this using a software-based encoder known as OBS, but there are plenty of options out there that you can use for this. The tech behind this essentially is a protocol known as RTMP. Essentially, what we do here with the external app or device produced pathway is we allow you to go and build the content that you want in your external software or hardware, such as OBS, and then you output that production via RTMP into the event itself. And I'll show you how to set all that up here in just a few moments. Now we have a set of roles that we need to level set on to make sure that we understand, who's who in the zoo, if you will. First and foremost, of course, we've got the tenant admin, right? We've got to turn things on. If the tenant admin has disabled live events, well, then this is going to be a short experience for you. So make sure that we've got live event enabled. We have an organizer. The organizer's job is, as you would expect, to organize the event, right? They will schedule the live event. They'll set the permissions for the attendees, meaning, is this a public event that anyone can join? Or is this an org only or a private type event that only authenticated users can join? The organizer will choose which production method is being used, like we covered on the last slide. Are we producing it in Teams, or are we producing it in an external app or encoder using RTMP? It's important to note, once you have made your selection for where it is produced, you can't change it. If you want to change it, you have to delete the event and reschedule it. The organizer will also set up whatever options they want, such as the moderated Q&A, captioning, translations, if appropriate, right? We'll cover that as we go a little bit further into this session. They will be then responsible for sending out the invite to the attendees, adding whatever presenters or other producer roles that they want, and then they can also manage all of the reporting after the event is over. The producer is essentially the host, right, of the event itself. Oftentimes the organizer is the producer, but not always. But the job of the producer is, as the name implies, to produce the event. Now again, if they're producing in Teams, then they'll be responsible for selecting the video feeds of the presenters, what content to share, pushing it live, starting the event, moderating the Q&A, right? Doing all of that in the Teams application. If they're using the external app or encoder, well, then they have the same role. They just wouldn't be doing those features inside of Teams. They would be doing those features inside of their external encoder or external application, such as OBS. The presenter, their job is to present content, right? They will, again, with the Teams produced event, they'll join the live event with their Teams client. They'll present their audio, video, desktop share, just like they normally would in a regular Teams meeting. If we're using external app or encoder, well, now they have to find some other way to get content into that encoder. And I'll talk to that specific point a little bit later in this session. And then lastly, of course, you got the attendee. They're the folks that watch the event. The cool thing about the way live events work today is watching the live event is a streaming experience, but we've also included a DVR component. So the attendee could pause, they could rewind, they could fast forward the event as they're working through it. Based on how we set the event up. And then of course they'll be able to participate in Q&A. So let's dive into the how, right? And first and foremost, if you're going to be using Teams live events and you're going to be doing Teams produced live events, which is the most common scenario, you got to make sure that Teams is working properly. And first and foremost, make sure that you've got a really good internet connection and that you've got the appropriate ports and IP addresses open. You can see them on the slide here. We actually document them out on our public docs page as well. Make sure that you have Teams essentially healthy and functional. Right? Step 2, as we talked about, we've got to go ahead and create the events. Well, who can create the live events? We mentioned earlier that it is an IT admin, right, that is going to be responsible for enabling these things. But there's a few other caveats to be aware of as we document on the slide here. There are licensing requirements that we need to follow, as you see on the slide. There is a policy that is controlled by the IT administrator as to who can create live events or not. So all of these things have to kind of fall into place to make sure that you have the ability to go into your Teams client and schedule a live event. It is important to note that you can only schedule live events in the Teams application. You cannot do it through Outlook. You have to use the Teams application. Now, as far as who can attend live events, well, that's going to depend on what we call the audience scope. Or when I, as the organizer, schedule the live event, I will be given basically 3 choices, which you'll see in a few of the upcoming slides here. Do I want the event to be public, which basically means, hey, if you've got the URL, if I sent you the join link, you can get into the event. Or do you want them to be private, where you have to actually sign in with a verified account to be able to access the live event itself? And when you do private live events, you can scope them to the entire organization. So like anybody in your company could get in, or you could scope it further down. Like maybe it's a team all hands event and you don't want anybody in the company to get there, just people in your team. You could scope that down to a specific group if you wanted to. As far as organizing the live events, as we mentioned before, we've got licensing requirements that we need to be aware of. From a producer and a presenter standpoint, well, generally speaking, we want you to have a Microsoft Teams license. So that's, the eSKUs, the ASKUs, what have you. Basically you are licensed for Teams. If you don't have a license for Teams, that doesn't mean that you're out of luck, right? There are two other ways that you can allow someone to present in a live event. One option is to permit anonymous folks to present in a live event. And the second option is you could invite an external user as a guest into your tenant. I'll cover both of those on the next 2 slides. The simplest approach for allowing presenters access to your live event if they don't have a Teams account is to support the anonymous presenter role. Now we do this by scheduling the live event and toggling a switch that we have that reads allow external presenters. By toggling this switch, it will activate the ability for us to permit external anonymous folks to join my live event as a presenter. Now, in order to properly facilitate this, I have to have at least one in-tenant user, right? Someone that's in the tenant where the event was scheduled, actually join the event. Because as you can imagine, if it's an anonymous presenter, well, we wouldn't actually know who they are just by looking at their name. So we need to vet them. So essentially what would happen is the anonymous presenter would land inside of our Teams lobby, and then I would have to basically look at who's in the lobby and decide whether I want to admit them. If I do admit them, I would then need to promote them to the presenter role. With this option, the cool thing is your presenter doesn't have to have an Azure Active Directory or an AAD identity. They don't even have to have a Teams account. They don't even have to have ever used Teams before in their life. You can just simply invite them. When they click the join link, they can install the Teams client right in that process, type in the name of who they are, and they'll immediately land in the lobby for me to vet them and bring them into the live event. Now, once I bring them in, I will then need to promote them to the presenter role. And once I do that, they will have the ability to share their audio and video, share their content, and see the team chat, the event team chat in the Teams live event itself. This anonymous presenter that gets promoted will not be able to access the meeting Q&A, and they will not be able to boot people out of the live event. So those are a couple of limitations you have to be aware of, right? Of course, if the user that is presenting does have a Teams account already, then they can just be invited and join the event. They don't have to go through this external presenter process if it's not required. If you don't want to go down the anonymous route, you could also leverage the concept of an Azure guest. And to do that, what you would do is go into Microsoft Teams, create a new team. I typically create a new team for the event called the Green Room or something of that nature. And then I invite this external user as a guest to this team. Now the user will receive a guest invitation in their email. They'll have to accept the guest invitation and join the team using their Teams client. Once they have access to that team, I can then schedule the live event, invite that guest account as a presenter, and that person would then be able to join as an authenticated presenter in my Teams live event. Now this is a little tricky because the whole guest process with the invite and so forth is a little cumbersome, especially for someone that doesn't use Teams, but it is a much more secure pathway because now you know that this is the verified identity of the person that you're inviting to present, as opposed to the previous slide, which is much more convenient, but it's anonymous. So you're effectively assuming that the name that they type in when they join is actually who that particular person is. All right, there's a few best practices to be aware of here if you go down the guest route. Essentially, when you're using guest, they're just using that account to join the event, right? They're not going to have a calendar to look at in Teams, because guests don't have a calendar when they're in Teams. But ideally, they would just use that account signed in as that guest in Teams to be able to join the live event and present. Step 3, we can look at live event policies. I had mentioned this earlier, that your team's admin can control this. You can see there's a policy setting here for live event policies, noted allow scheduling. If this is toggled off and this is assigned to you, you will not be able to schedule a live event. Last option is an optional option called setting up your video distribution solution. This is also known as an enterprise CDN or an ECDN. And this is for a very specific use case. The use case would be this. Let's imagine that we are doing an all hands for our company, and we'll just say that we have 5,000 people in the company. Now, of course, for the past year or so, most of our folks have been working remote. We've all been at our home offices, right? But let's imagine a time before the pandemic, or as we're slowly getting back to normal, quote unquote normal here. Imagine a time when we actually had folks in the office. Now, let's say of those 5,000 people, we have 500 people all sitting in one of my offices. Of course, that one office has its own internet circuit. By default, if those 500 folks are watching the live event, we will get 500 individual streams coming in from the service to each of the 500 attendees. That could quickly saturate my public internet pipe coming into that office, because there's a high concentration of attendees in one location. The idea of leveraging an ECDN is it allows us to take advantage of peer-to-peer technology. So instead of having 500 streams come in to 500 individual attendees in one office, I would have maybe 2 or 3 streams come in to the office. And then internally, using peer-to-peer technology, we would disseminate that to all of the 500 folks. So enterprise CDNs essentially allow us to optimize the bandwidth consumption in places where we have a high density of attendees. Now, it is important to note that these video distribution solutions are third-party, and I have a few slides a little later that talk about who they are. But they are not a requirement to use with live events. They are simply an optimization that we can use. All right, let's quickly run through what it looks like to schedule the event experiences that we've talked about up to this point. Now, as we mentioned earlier, first and foremost, we've got to select our event experience, and often that is going to be based on what do I want my attendees to do. What I want their attendee experience to be like. There are a few other things to keep in mind, and that's why we've built a slide like this one here. What type of event do we think it is, right? Is it a once and done? Is it a series? Is it a community type event? There's our attendee experience. Do we want it interactive? Do we want managed Q&A? Do we not want any discussion, right? What's our scale, right? What is the scale that we're looking to get towards? And what are we thinking about for production? Right? Are we just going to do the simple out-of-box Teams experience, right? Do we want to have multiple people in determined layouts, like what we would call a fireside chat, where we have 4 or 5 people on the screen at the same time? Or do we want to go all out and get full-on custom production, where we can get that professional broadcast type experience, where maybe we not only have changing layouts, but we have lower thirds that show their names. We have a ticker on the bottom, all kinds of cool stuff that you can do. So this is kind of the blueprint, if you will, for how you think about selecting your event experience. Now, this is not exhaustive. This is going to evolve over time, but this is a great starting point for how you want to select your event experience. So let's follow a first scenario. I'm going to do an event, and that event, it might run once, it might run in a series, it might run, as a community type event, right? But it could be any one of these types, but I'm definitely looking for interactivity, I want folks to be able to speak. I want them to turn on their video. I want that type of interactivity. I'm not looking to go beyond 1,000 people for that type experience, and I'm totally cool with doing the standard webcam screen share experience, maybe even using the cool advanced presenter layouts, right? The stuff that Teams gives me out of the box. With this type of scenario, it's highly recommended that we leverage a Teams meeting, because from a Teams meeting perspective, we get all of these features and functions that we wanted. Now think about it. If I wanted all of this, and then I also wanted to be able to say, you know, I'd really like to collect registration info for this type of experience, that's a webinar. It's simply a Teams meeting plus the registration piece, and boom, I've got myself a webinar. Now, this is where it gets fun. Say I want to do this type of an event, but now I'm looking for managed Q&A, right? I want to scale a little bit broader, maybe up to 20,000. Yeah, I want to have multiple presenters, right? Now I'm starting to get into the realm of live events. Some of the other options that you see here are also very well suited for live events, but we'll deal with that on the next slide. But before I leave this one, I do want to make sure that I talk a little bit about some upcoming changes that we have in this live event space. We are working to bring the live events experience into the Teams meeting stack. So what does that actually mean, right? Well, what it means is some of the scenarios that you see here that are kind of cut and dry, right? Like I kind of draw this line here, and anything that's above the line is a meeting, anything that's below the line is a live event. Well, really what's going to happen is this middle row is going to be capable of doing either or. Because today, absolutely, we can do a live event where we have managed Q&A up to 20,000 people with multiple presenters. But with the advent of Teams meetings, plus managed Q&A apps that we're building, plus the view-only experience that we've added into the ability to work with meetings, we could potentially leverage a Teams meeting plus overflow, or plus view-only as we call it, to get this middle row experience. Now, the reason I don't have that on this slide here is because the view-only experience is not quite up to par for that scenario yet. As of this recording or as of this presentation, we're currently limited in what our view-only experience is. Once the view-only experience comes up to par with the way that the interactive intermeeting looks, then we'll be able to start moving this middle row of experience types over to a Teams meeting plus the view-only experience. But until then, a live event will definitely suffice. Now, does that mean live events are going away? Not anytime soon, because there is always going to be a need for this broadcast style that we see like down at the bottom here, where I have to hit this very large reach of 100,000 folks. And I just want the few to many type experience, right? I don't want any degree of interactivity. Now, as I mentioned before, when you look at that slide, previous slide with the last two rows, you really start to see the power of what live events can do. But there's a little bit more depth to how we incorporate the live event stack to facilitate those experiences. So first off, if I'm going to have up to 20,000 people, I have the opportunity to use Teams, as we have talked about up to this point. I could also use Yammer or Stream, right? Again, this is really just about where is your audience, right? Do you want your audience to watch the event in Teams? Do you want them to watch the event in Yammer? Do you want them to watch the event in Stream? This is all about where is your audience. So if I have 20,000 people and they're all in Teams, boom, I'm doing Teams, baby. And if I'm going to go that pathway, then I'm going to follow the top line here. Right? This top line is all Teams. This gives me the flexibility of being able to include people from outside my org, what we would call a public live event. In order to have public live events, folks need to watch it in Teams, right? This gives me my moderated Q&A. I get to use the Teams UI, life is good, and boom, we're all done in Teams. Now, if I have 20,000 people, let's say that I want them to watch it in Yammer or Stream. Well, that takes me down this pathway here. And the first thing you have to realize is that if you're going to watch this in Yammer or Stream, this can only include authenticated people from inside of your organization. Yammer and Stream do not support anonymous or public live events. So keep that in mind. If that's where your attendees are, they're going to have to be authenticated, folks, right? The main difference between Yammer and Stream is the Yammer pathway is this middle one here. Yammer is all about open discussion, right? We're still using the Teams client to produce the event, right? So a typical Teams experience, but my attendees in Yammer, right? So all of the chat and Q&A conversation is going to happen through Yammer. If I don't care about attendee Q&A discussions, then I can go into Microsoft Stream and have folks just watch it in a browser, right? Again, remember, this is authenticated people that you're watching in the browser, not anonymous. Now, if I go the Stream route, I can't utilize Teams. Now I'm into custom production here. I can't produce it in Teams. I have to use an encoder like OBS or vMix or Wirecast or what have you. And I'm going to output this via RTMP, like we talked about before. I'm going to output this via RTMP, and they will be watching the event in Stream. That gives me my scale up to 100,000 also, by the way. Right? Currently today, we're going to be doing that in Microsoft Stream, and away we go. We are working to bring support for 100,000 folks inside of Teams later this calendar year. So you would have the capability of being able to run a Teams live event with up to 100,000 attendees. Let's cover some of the concepts of production and how we schedule the live event. So to produce, we need to have an external app or encoder. We also need a good skilled production staff to be able to run through this. We have to schedule the live event. I am going to show an example of the external app encoder using OBS. And then, of course, we need something to go into OBS, an active source of content to go into OBS. I'm going to actually show you how to do this with a Teams meeting. Right? We're going to use the Teams meeting as our virtual stage to bring folks into our event. So check it out. This slide is showcasing what we refer to as the virtual stage. The cool thing about the virtual stage concept is it's just a regular Teams meeting. So you will go set up an out-of-band Teams meeting, right? Just a regular Teams meeting that only your presentation crew gets invited to. And to them, they're just clicking a join link and boom, come into a Teams meeting, right? It's very, very familiar to them. They, my remote participants here, simply join a Teams meeting and away they go. Now, I, as the producer, I've got some cool tricks up my sleeve. I am, of course, in this same Teams meeting because I'm part of the event team. But now I can use technology like NDI. NDI allows me to take the video feeds that you see here in the Teams meeting and break them apart into individual feeds, like Lego bricks. Now that these are individual pieces, I can bring them into my encoder, OBS in this example, and they're Lego blocks. I can start building whatever views I want. So I could have a scene that has all 4 people in it, like you see here, with my own custom graphics overlaid over it. And maybe their name panels, name badges, or lower thirds, or what have you, all built on there. Or I could transition to another scene that maybe full screens this particular presenter because she is currently the dominant speaker. And then I could jump to another screen that has just these 2 presenters, right? Once I break these out with NDI, they're like Lego building blocks. I can start building my scenes exactly the way that I want for my audience. And then the output of what I'm doing here in OBS in my encoder goes out via RTMP to my audience, right? And where's your audience? Well, it depends, right? We talked about before where your audience could be. Are they in Teams? Are they in Stream? Are they in Yammer? They could be on social platforms like Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, so forth, right? The awesomeness of using an encoder like this is this RTMP output can go to whatever destination you want, assuming that destination supports an RTMP feed. The horsepower that handles this is done on our production system, which is running, in this case, in my example, OBS, right? This runs your application. This is where you do all the heavy lifting. This is where you do all the changing of scenes, right? And then this outputs via RTMP, and away you go. To tie back to what we talked about earlier, when you schedule the live event, you pick this radio button for an external app or device. That's what lights up the RTMP feature. You'll see in a few slides when we go through the experience itself, when you go to actually produce the event, you'll get a URL like this. That's the RTMP ingest URL. That's basically where you're going to point your production software. You'll say, hey, take the output from here and send it here, and away you go. Now that's all well and good when you're dealing with RTMP. I have had folks ask me though, hey Brian, I really would like to be able to use the coolness of OBS, but man, I want to be able to send it to public people. I want them to watch it in Teams. Like I don't necessarily want them to watch it on a browser in Stream or something like that. How could I take this output from OBS and get it into Teams directly without going through this RTMP stuff, right? Actually, there is a way to do that. You can set this radio button to Teams, and you can use a series of devices such as capture cards from Magewell or virtual devices like virtual cameras and virtual mics to bring the output of OBS directly into your Teams application. Now, I don't have time to go into that in this session, but if you check out the advanced production playbook on aka.ms/virtualeventplaybook, I show you exactly how to do that particular scenario. Scheduling a live event in Teams, very straightforward. Go to my calendar, hit the drop-down chevron, pick live event, set up my live event, give it a title, of course, my date and time, invite my producers and or presenters. If I need to toggle the allow external presenter option, I can, and away we go. It is important to note here at this stage, if you are planning to do an external encoder event using RTMP, right, the radio button for an app or external encoder, if you go ahead and add presenters here, that only gives them access to the Q&A app, right? Because again, remember when you selected that second radio button of external app or encoder, you're not actually facilitating it with Teams, right? It's all being done through your encoder. Now, as I talked about earlier, as we move through the scheduling, we'll have the option of setting my event permissions, right? These are the permissions for your attendees, right? Do I want it to be just my org where they're required to sign in? Do I want it to be just a subset of folks in my org? Again, they would still be required to sign in. Or do I want it to be public where anyone that has the link can watch it? Notice in my screenshot here, this public is grayed out. It's grayed out because we have the radio button for an external app or device selected. And remember, I mentioned earlier, if you are using RTMP, which is this option here, we don't support public yet. And that's because currently RTMP events are being surfaced in Stream, and Stream doesn't support anonymous folks yet. We are working to bring this into Teams, and when we do bring this into Teams, when you select this radio button, this option will then light up, but we're not quite there yet. A little bit later in calendar year 21. The how you produce is what we had referred to earlier. If I pick the Teams option, it's all done in Teams. I get the Teams producer console and away we go. If I select an external app or device, this is what's going to give me the RTMP links. And this is where I can set options such as Q&A or post caption options if I desire that. Once you've scheduled the event, you need your attendee link. Super, super important that you follow this process. After you've scheduled the live event, you'll have an option here to get the attendee link. And again, depending on how you've scheduled it, this will either be a single link for Teams, or if you chose the external encoder option, you'll have two. Watch it in Teams, watch it in Stream. You have to get the attendee link from here. Do not scroll down here and find the join live event link and copy and paste that. That is your event team link. That is for your presenters only. You should always be grabbing the attendee link from here. Now, as I mentioned, if we're using the external encoder option, we still need to get content to feed into that encoder. I need to build my virtual stage, right? I'm going to build my virtual stage utilizing a Teams meeting. Teams meetings are pretty straightforward. You can go ahead and set up a standard Teams meeting. Of course, policies would apply from an administrative standpoint, but we're just going to go ahead and set up a regular Teams meeting. Going to go ahead and invite my event team to this regular Teams meeting. Now, again, notice this is different from the live event, right? The live event that we've scheduled, that's what's going to my attendees. That's where all the production is happening. This meeting that we're scheduling here, this is for my event team to join. This is my virtual stage. So I will invite all of my attendees, or excuse me, I will invite all of my presenters that are on the event team to this particular Teams meeting. Got a bunch of meeting options that I can set here to kind of set the experience that I want. Again, this is my event team meeting, so I'm going to want to make sure that only my event team members are gaining access to this meeting. Few other meeting options that we can set here, the most prominent being how we control who can bypass the lobby, how we control who can present, right? These are all critical items that we want to make sure that we have set correctly inside of the Teams meeting. And now we get to the production side. Now, when we talk about external encoders or external applications, there are a set of encoders that we have already tested and validated with the service. And you can see them on the right-hand side of the slide here. Does that mean these are the only ones you can use? Nah. There's definitely other encoders that you can use. You just want to do your own dry runs with them and make sure they operate properly. And you want to pay special attention on the left side here to the settings that we document, right? This is using RTMB. It is a single bit rate. We want to make sure that we've got video set up appropriately, right? Max bit rate, constant CBR as opposed to variable, 30 FPS, max of 720p. So don't send us anything higher than that because we're going to cap at 720p. Set your audio appropriately, and if you've got these settings set up properly, you should be just fine using an encoder that perhaps isn't on this list. This slide just shows the overall flow of the advanced production process. We've talked about all of these, but as a recap, we schedule it, right? I schedule, where's my audience going to be? Are they going to be in Stream, Yammer, or Teams? Well, I can go ahead and organize that, typically using my Teams client. I then need to produce using my app or device, right? In this example, I was using OBS Studio. Remember, my virtual stage is another Teams meeting that's going to be fed into this. The output of my production is going to go via RTMP to the service here. Once the producer hits the go live button, right? That then gets sent over our cloud delivery network through Azure Media Services through our CDN to the attendees, and the attendees can view it over here. This is the optional third-party ECDN that I talked about. This is the one where if you have a high density of attendees in one physical location, you might want to consider investing in the third-party ECDN. If you don't, then you don't require this particular option. Now, when it comes to showtime, we're going to go join the event as the producer or the presenter, right? When I click on this live event, I can do it either through the Teams or the Outlook UI. I will be presented with a screen that looks like this. Again, this is when I have selected the external app or encoder option when I scheduled the live event. You notice I've got no join button, no audio, video, no nothing, right? Because that's not happening here. What's happening here is I'm setting up the plumbing so that my encoder has a place to send its destination. So you'll notice when I get into this screen on the right, I have my RTMP URL. Great. Of course, if I just copy and paste this right now, nothing's going to happen because the service isn't ready. It's not listening, if you will. That's the job of the Start Setup button. So as a producer, I'm going to come in here, and this is, again, ahead of the event, probably about 30 minutes ahead of the event. I'm going to come in here and click Start Setup. That's going to go ahead and provision some services on the back end and get it ready to listen for content to come in via this RTMP feed. Once all of the processing is ready on the back end, you'll get this dialog, ready to connect. Now you can take the URL that you see here and bring it over to your encoder, which would be OBS in my example, and configure the encoder to send its output to that destination. Remember, if you are a presenter, not a producer, if you're a presenter and you join this type of live event, you will get this view where you're basically seeing what the attendees see, and you'll have access to the Q&A, right? But in this live event view, you don't have any way to come off mute or say anything because, again, it's not a Teams meeting. It's not Teams anything because it's not being produced in Teams. Now that we've got the back end ready to roll, we're going to take this and connect to the encoder. With my OBS example, I'm going to go in OBS into settings. I'm going to go to stream. Under service, I'll select custom. Under server, that's where I'm going to paste the server ingest URL. Boom. Now stream key, we don't actually use a stream key, but OBS is expecting something to be in here. So you can put whatever you want. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the same combination I have on my luggage. Fantastic. Just put anything there. Otherwise, OBS won't let you save out of this screen. Side note, you might notice there's 2 URLs here, server and secondary. This is not primary and backup, right? These are actually both pointing to the same system, but different ports. And it's there for redundancy from a durability and resiliency standpoint. It is not meant to be primary and backup. If you want primary and backup, you need multiple live events with multiple encoders. When all the wiring is up, you can then hit the Start Streaming button in OBS. And once you've hit the Start Streaming button in OBS, you should now see some streaming stats. Ideally, it's green coming out of OBS. And in about 20-30 seconds, you should see the same content showed up in the preview window here in the presenter view. Excuse me, in the producer view. If you don't see any content here, something's wrong. So make sure you get this all ironed out because whatever you're showing here in OBS should be sent via RTMP to this preview screen here. Once you've got that all established and looking good, then you can click the Start Event button. This is your go live, right? Once you've clicked Start Event here, the event is live for your attendees. And the only thing you can do at this point is stop it. You can't pause it. You can't restart it. All you can do is stop it. So make sure you don't stop the event until you're actually done with the event. Lastly, we have our post-event steps. When you're done, you can go back to the live event that you scheduled in Teams, and you'll have a set of resources available to you. Again, the listing of resources will be dependent on whether you produced the event in Teams or whether you produced it in an external encoder. If you did it in Teams, you're going to get a bunch of things like the recording, the Q&A report, the attendee engagement report, and so forth. If you're using third-party ECDNs, you might get some of their insights here as well. If you're using a third-party encoder or an external encoder, I should say, you'll get the Q&A report that you can download, but you won't have an attendee engagement report available to you, right? So this view is, again, going to be dependent on how you've chosen to produce your event. One last item that I want to cover is a shout out to our Live Events Assistance Program. If you've gone through this content and you've thought, wow, this is great stuff, but I'd really like to have someone talk me through this with my specific requirements or kind of give me a helping hand through this, that's what the Live Event Assistance Program is for. Currently, this is a no-cost program. You can access it through the aka.ms link you see on the slide here. This will connect you to an awesome set of my peers that will help you with the before, during, and after for your event. So help you understand what technology you should use based on the requirements that you have, live events, meetings, webinars, and so forth. Help you go through dry runs or rehearsals of the event, be available for assistance during the event, and also help you wrap the event up. And finally, we want to make sure that we include a set of resources for you on our resource slide. Of course, some of these are very familiar that you've seen up to this point, such as our virtual event playbook and the live events assistance team that I just talked about in the previous slide. But I also want to shout out to the Virtual Event Forum. This is a location you can come to in our community that will have a set of experts available for you to ask any type of question that you want around virtual events. Great way to get engagement from not only our SMEs, but also the rest of the community. Speaking of community, we have a couple of links here to our base community and tech community that you can definitely explore and see other areas that you might want to have some open discussions in. Great resources here for our organizers from a checklist perspective, as well as our base adoption site. And lastly, we can't forget about using the Teams client itself. Go into the help, lower left of the Teams app, click training, and you'll be able to access various training resources from there. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to watch the session. We hope this has been helpful, and we look forward to seeing you around. Thanks all.